Today is May 6th, 2026, and we have a few different stories today to cover. And the first of which is about a New York Times interview that was released this weekend with Tucker Carlson. This was a long-form interview. A lot of questions were asked related to the Trump administration, the war in Iran, where Tucker sees the future of the Republican Party going. And if you haven't seen it, you should check it out or read the transcript. I would say that the interview was interesting in some areas, boring in many others. Every time these kinds of interviews are done by someone who is essentially an insider like Tucker Carlson or Joe Kent, I think the expectation of many people is that there's going to be some kind of inside baseball that's going to be discussed, or some behind the scenes information about the administration, for example, that will be discussed. Safe to say none of that happened. In fact, when the New York Times asked him questions related specifically to some behind the scenes intrigue within the Trump administration, Tucker oftentimes obfuscated or just blatantly lied. So it wasn't too interesting, but it was definitely something to check out if you want to learn a little bit more about Tucker Carlson and how he maneuvers and positions himself. But a couple areas of the interview stood out to me. And this question that the New York Times asked him is related to the future of the Republican Party, essentially. Now, she said, listen, there's a strain in the Republican Party, especially among young people who are racist, who talk about J.D. Vance and his marriage in a particular way. And I'm asking you, and you can decide not to answer it, but I'm asking you if that is going to be a problem for Vance leading the party. And this is the assumption amongst a lot of Republicans right now, that J.D. Vance is going to be leading the Republican Party in the presidential elections in 2028. I've said in several videos that I actually don't see this happening because of his attachment to Trump. I think that's going to be a huge liability, especially as we continue to see what's going on with the Trump administration over the past year and a half. I think that the decisions Trump is making are direct. J.D. Vance is directly implicated in those decisions. It's going to be very difficult for him to distance himself from any decision, popular or unpopular, that the administration makes. And so for those reasons, I would say that Vance probably won't be the candidate in 28. There's a lot of money behind him. It's not like there's not going to be an attempt to press him to the front of the line, but I'm not seeing it. I don't think that it's going to happen. I don't think he's going to get past the finish line. But anyways, Tucker responded and he said, let me answer your question. You are unable to tell me how Fuentes was influential in any other way than views on a video. It's not meaningful. Does he have influence on our politics? I haven't seen any. So let's just start there. And I'm going to stop there because he's talking about Nick Fuentes. He is a very talented right-wing commentator. And earlier in the conversation, for a good length of the interview, actually, the questions that Tucker was being asked was directly about Fuentes in an interview that he did with him last year that Tucker got a lot of flack for. Very controversial interview. But she was talking in that portion of the interview about Fuentes' influence on the right wing. And there is he does have notable influence on the right wing, but Tucker is denying this. And the reason that he's denying it is because him and Nick Fuentes have had a very contentious relationship over the years. It starts with Joe Kent, actually, who is a good friend of Tucker Carlson. And Joe Kent actually ran for Congress, a congressional seat, 2 times, I believe, in the state of Washington. First time he did it, Tucker was behind him, and Nick offered to endorse him and help his campaign as long as Joe Kent didn't disavow Nick and Nick's positions on race and Israel and all these other things. Well, Joe Kent went ahead and disavowed Nick, and Nick and his followers ended up derailing the congressional bid for Joe Kent that first time. And so this infuriated Tucker Carlson, and he, over the years, has made disparaging comments about Nick. He actually worked with Max Blumenthal on a hit piece that went after Fuentes a couple years ago. And in the second case, Nick has oftentimes criticized Tucker Carlson, his father, who ran Voice of America, which is a CIA outfit. And so there's this idea that Tucker Carlson is a Fed, which is possible. Given the way Tucker answers questions in this very interview, it's very possible that he is some kind of intelligence asset like his father was. And so there's been this criticism that's been going back and forth between Fuentes and Carlson for years. And just last year, they had an interview together. It wasn't really too contentious. A lot of people said it was a softball interview, but you'd have thought that that would have put a lot of the problems between them to rest when they went over a lot of the things that many of the issues that they had disagreements over the years. But things are basically the same. And so in a way, I think that Fuentes lives rent-free in Tucker's mind. He knows he's a talented young man. He knows he's popular. And so this is why he reverts to this response when asked about J.D. Vance. But he goes on to say he hasn't seen any influence from Fuentes. And he said, second, J.D. Vance's problems with young people and old people and the party itself revolve around his views on foreign policy and economics, which are the issues that actually matter. And honestly, my opinion is that it's not any of these issues that makes J.D. Vance unpopular among young people or boomers or your classic Republicans and this kind of thing. I would just say it's him. And increasingly, it's going to be what he's associated with when it comes to the Trump administrations and the decisions that are made then. Overall, he's just not that likable. I don't think that outside of Donald Trump, he's carved a distinct political identity for himself. And it's going to be hard for him as time goes on to create that distinct political identity that's separate from Trump and his policies. It's going to be hard over time to do that, especially as we're getting into midterms and another presidential cycle pretty soon. So this is just topical. These are topical issues. I don't think we're at a place yet where we can say that there's a bunch of people out there who dislike Vance because of some particular economic strategy that or policy that he's laid out that he wants to implement in the future or anything like that. We're just not there yet. So he goes on to say that Fuentes is a distraction because he talks about racial issues, and those don't have anything to do with power and economics, which are really what's afflicting young people and this kind of thing. So he looks at Nick and his messaging as a distraction. And I think that those two actually are, when you think about the economic issues in the country and immigration, for example, those are intrinsically bound together. And these are issues that do resonate with young people. You can say that the immigration falls into the racial category, and again that's tied to economics and where people are financially and why they're struggling. So I think that it's a misjudgment there on Tucker's part. He goes on to say, so Washington's response, Wall Street Journal's response as well, is to be like, let's have a race war and you guys can argue over blacks or whites. And basically, he's saying that they're looking to divide and conquer based on these issues. And maybe there's some of that going on within the power spectrum, but racial issues, immigration issues, and economics, they're all important to certain people, And I think that Tucker has revealed that over the years. It is when he was over at Fox News. Racial issues don't not matter to Americans, right? This is one of the reasons why Tucker for a long time talked about replacement migration. That is a conversation. It's an important one that resonates with many white people in the country, white Americans. And he was the one who talked about that and really kind of popularized it. And now he's again talking out the other side of his mouth and saying, well, no one really cares about racial issues, or their racial issues don't have anything to do with immigration and people actually adapting or adapting in the country. And Immigration doesn't have anything to do with economics. I think they're all basically tied together. And so, you know, in terms of the outlook, as I just said, I think all of those issues are going to be important in 2028. Donald Trump, when he ran in 2015, shined a spotlight on many of the issues that Republicans, traditional Republicans, otherwise wouldn't have thought were important at all, including racial issues, immigration, of course, foreign entanglements, and this kind of thing. A lot of issues that there was a narrative crafted for many of those problems that were fed to the voters every year before Trump. And so they're at the forefront now, and I don't think they're going away. And I don't think that Tucker can make them go away by just saying, well, nobody cares about these issues. They just care about the economics. They're not making enough money. That's why they're complaining about, racial issues or immigration and this kind of stuff. He does acknowledge that they're important issues, but I think he downplays it to an extent that he downplays it, and there's an underappreciation for how much those issues will influence the 2028 elections and outcomes. Now, the other piece to this is the question that he was asked about his son, Buckley. Again, J.D. Vance and Tucker are very good friends. Tucker's son, Buckley, worked as a secretary for J.D. Vance for a while, up until the point when there was a falling out between Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. And he was asked about that termination. And he brought in to the conversation a slogan that we'll discuss in just a moment that he uses over and over again. And so the interviewer asked him, how did your son leave or lose his job if he wasn't forced out? And Tucker responded and said, I don't know, you can ask him. Obviously, he's lying there. He was there for over a year. The White House is an intense place to work. I don't want to talk about my son. He's got nothing to do with this. But that's kind of the point. We need to defend the core beliefs of our civilization, which, by the way, are attractive to the entire world. People move here not just for a robust economy, but because they want to be judged on the basis of what they did and not what their parents did. And so what he's doing is he's invoking this slogan that he continues to use, blood guilt, right? The sins of the parents shouldn't affect their offspring. So he applies this to the Gaza situation. When Israel attacks Gaza, levels the entire area, if you will. It's a form of collective punishment for everybody there. Everyone is guilty of the sins of their parents for maybe voting for Hamas or something. And so he calls that blood guilt. It says all the Palestinian Arabs are being punished for their blood, for maybe the sins of their parents. And that's something that he's against, that I think a lot of people are against. Same thing with this situation with his son. Well, his son shouldn't pay the price for a falling out that he had between himself and Donald Trump. And we'll go further here. He said, that's the whole point. That's collective punishment. It's blood guilt, and we reject it. I gave this lecture to Fuentes. I gave it to Mike Huckabee, and it never changes. It's the idea of our core idea of our civilization. And so again, this is a slogan that he always goes back to. And he does it also when the discussion of Israel comes up, because he makes this distinction, and he says there are people out there who say that all Jews are guilty of what's going on in the Gaza Strip, right? He says that's blood guilt. He believes that that's kind of the narrative that Nick follows. All Jews are guilty for societal ills and all of these other things. Now, I think that the reason he does this, specifically in the context of the wars that are going on in the Middle East, is because it's a way to keep the focus, the criticism on Israel, the state of Israel, and their government. He wants the U.S. to disassociate with Netanyahu and the Likud party because of the wars that they are driving us into, that the Likud party is driving us into. But the issue with this is that truthfully, there's a separate discussion that has to be had, and it's that regardless of who governs Israel at the end of the day and what their domestic or foreign policy looks like, the U.S. is going to prop up the state of Israel no matter what. So this idea of decoupling that Tucker and people like Joe Kent has, it's, in my estimation, it's not going to happen because of issues that we're going to get into. But the thing we have to understand is that Tucker talks like this because I think he's not interested in discussing Jewish influence generally within our country or their proximity to institutional decision-making power in our government specifically. Now, if he was, like I just said, him and Joe Kent would acknowledge our special relationship with Israel is likely unalterable. There are Jewish interests in the diaspora that see the state of Israel as an intrinsic part of themselves, of their peoplehood, of their identity. Naturally, races and tribes want to preserve their identities by any means, right? And so without U.S. support, Israel would have ceased to be a state a long time ago. Therefore, our country is necessary for the preservation of their state and, by extension, their identity as a people. Their survival as a nation, in the minds of many Jews in the diaspora, is contingent on the survival of their state. And the interested parties within the Jewish community will ensure that relationship with the U.S. that ensures their state's survival and their survival never ends. And I hesitate to think of what happens if it does. So their presence and status within our governing institutions alone assures me that there will be no decoupling. And we have to think about their status and their proximity to power, raw power and decision-making when it comes, for example, to national security decisions. So is this how all Jews perceive themselves in relation to the state of Israel? No, it's not. But it's a position shared by many of the actual decision makers, like I said, and power brokers that make the choices as they relate to our national security and influence our government. They're both Jewish. Many of them are, Zionist Christians and that kind of thing. So that we can set aside blood guilt, right? That's not a whole people that's jockeying to drive our country into war, but there are many who are in the decision-making apparatus that do drive the decision-making for our foreign policy, specifically in the Middle East. And, you could even look at an example of when we talk about liberal Jews. A lot of people will say, well, liberal Jews don't support what the state of Israel is doing. Oftentimes they never do. Many of them call Israel an ethno-state. But at the end of the day, they rightfully circled around the flag, whether they were liberal or not, after October 7th. I think that any nationality would do that because, again, it's about self-preservation. And so this overarching criticism that I'm fleshing out is that Tucker oftentimes just has a conversation about how we should decouple from Israel because their government is bad. I think that decoupling would be a great idea for our national security interests, us focusing on ourselves and making our own country better. But what I'm saying is that it's likely not going to happen because it's not just about their government. It's about the diaspora. It's about the survival of a people. In many of their minds, they believe is contingent on the state and the existence of the state. And I think many of the decision makers, the Jewish decision makers, will use any means to ensure that this relationship that we have between the U.S. and Israel never ends. And that's just kind of the way it is. So why does Tucker talk about this the way he does? Well, I think it's one of the things is that it just keeps him relevant. He shapeshifts so often, and he saw that being Israel critical was something that was popular, and he just jumped on it. Just like he's jumped on many other issues, aliens, all kinds of different things he's jumped on over the years. And you just never know. It truly is contingent. What he says is truly contingent on which way the wind is blowing. If if you watch him long enough, perhaps you can tease out some kind of, general thought process that's maybe skewed libertarian. Maybe you can get something out of him, but it shifts so often. And that's why oftentimes I look at him as more of a political operative than anything else. Not a commentator, not an influencer of some kind, but really a political operative. Again, maybe tied into our intel agencies. You never know. Paid to put out a certain kind of message. Maybe a foreign government. I don't know. I don't speculate on that stuff, but he's definitely not your run-of-the-mill conservative commentator. So that does it for the Tucker Carlson interview with the New York Times. Again, interesting little piece. Now, today we will be diving into some Middle East news, and we're going to start in Lebanon. This is from the 29th of April, the end of last month, and this is reported by Axios, where Donald Trump has actually given the Israeli government the green light to start surgically bombing southern Lebanon. So basically, there is a ceasefire, as we discussed, that was in place. It was put in place about a week and a half ago between Israel and Lebanon. Hezbollah wasn't a part of those negotiations, which is what the entity that Israel is at war with, but a ceasefire was forged. Another meeting was supposed to take place between Israel and Lebanon, and it was going to be brokered by Marco Rubio. The second meeting never took place, and Axios reported that Donald Trump has actually given Israel the green light on continuing to bomb southern Lebanon. They're still occupying southern Lebanon, which puts not only the ceasefire in jeopardy, but the ceasefire between Iran and the U.S. in jeopardy. So it says here, Trump told Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Israel should only take surgical military action in Lebanon and avoid a full resumption of war. And Trump is really operating in this gray area with Lebanon, but also in Iran. As we'll see in a minute when we get into the news with Iran, there has been kinetic action between the U.S. and Iran since the ceasefire ended, particularly over the past 3 days. Strikes have been shot by Iran, strikes have been taken by the U.S., but there hasn't been a formal resumption in Lebanon or with Iran of hostilities. And so, like I said, Trump is really operating in a gray area when it comes to these ceasefires that he's putting in place. I would say this is one of the reasons why Putin has constantly rejected a ceasefire with Ukraine, even though Trump has begged him to do it over the past year, because he knows that this is the way that they're gonna happen. And Putin's basically said, well, when we stop firing, the territories in the Donbass will be ours, and we're not going to start back hostilities. You know what I mean? We're going to negotiate and get everything hashed out, and then after that, we'll stop all the fighting. And this is as far as Trump has gotten with Putin. As you could see, that was good judgment on Vladimir Putin's part. So he wants this sort of tepid, low level hostilities to continue between Israel and Lebanon. Why? Because he doesn't want to see Iran react to it. Iran is not going to react to maybe a few missile strikes in his mind carried out by Israel on southern Lebanon. They're not going to react at the continuing occupation of southern Lebanon by Israel. So he's just trying to dance on a very thin line to make sure that he doesn't arouse Iran again. I think that that's something he's genuinely worried about. So as we talked about, there's no process on the Israeli-Lebanon talks that were supposed to follow the initial discussions that produced the ceasefire. Trump claims the ceasefire. Obviously, he's said this for a while. Iran disagrees with it, but he says the ceasefire with Lebanon and Israel is unconnected to the events, to the ceasefire in Iran. Hezbollah has continued in Israel. They've both continued to trade strikes over the past week. And Israel has probably not been surgical. Axios reports that they've actually expanded airstrikes on southern Lebanon over the past week. So the Trump administration denied that the ceasefire is broken, even though Hezbollah wasn't a party to the ceasefire. But the officials within the administration said that Trump has asked Israel to show restraint. And so ultimately, the admin is looking to Israel and Lebanon to restrain Hezbollah. But that's very difficult if Israel is still in southern Lebanon and they don't plan on leaving. Now, following these events on the 4th of May, this was reported by the Journal. On Sunday, Trump announced a new initiative to help shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is still closed. There's a double blockade. Iran has got a portion of it blockaded. The U.S. has got another side blockaded. And Trump said that the U.S. would guide stranded ships through the Strait of Hormuz through a project that he's called Project Freedom. And the new mechanism is effectively a coordination cell to move traffic through the strait, involving countries, insurance companies, and shipping organizations, according to 2 senior U.S. officials. It doesn't currently involve U.S. Navy warships escorting the ships. Now, of course, without escorts, this is going to be very difficult to. It's just not possible to do it without warships escorting these cargo ships. And we don't have those kind of warships, and we have a few of them, but not enough in the region to escort all the shipping out of the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran just recently deployed naval mines to the strait. So the latest proposal would involve it locating the mines, passing the information to ships transiting the waterway so they can avoid danger, as well as identifying safer routes. The U.S. was, of course, seeking the support of European nations, Japan, and Eastern Asia to help with this effort. And of course, if there was interference, Trump has threatened that he would, level Iran. The same threats that we saw. Now, this initiative was to begin on Monday morning, and the U.S. military support. And again, this is an escort, but the support package would be 15,000 service members, guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft and unmanned platforms, and that's according to CENTCOM. And these assets will still have to worry about Iran's Mosquito fleet, the small boats that Iran has been using to harass shipping and prevent shipping from traversing the strait. Now, this isn't the first proposal like this. Last month, there was a maritime freedom construct proposal that the administration put out, and they were hoping again to build an international coalition to force open the strait, which would share information and coordinate diplomatically to enforce sanctions and to ensure safe passage for the shipping. That didn't work out. So this is kind of the latest iteration of that. Now, earlier last week, I believe it was Thursday, Friday, Iran made a proposal. This is their second proposal. We discussed the first one. They had a list of proposals to open up the strait and start discussing the nuclear program again. It was a counter proposal, and the first phase would include a complete end to the war within 30 days, a mutual guarantee of non-aggression by the U.S. and Israel, and an end to the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports in exchange for reopening up the strait, compensation for Iran to help rebuild, and the withdrawal of U.S. forces to from Iran's maritime perimeter. Now, all of this would be and basically what Iran would give would be more immediate access to nuclear talks. Because in the first set of proposals that Iran made about a week and a half ago, they kicked the can down on nuclear negotiations indefinitely. They weren't going to discuss their nuclear program at all. They would discuss it in a future undisclosed time. And in this proposal, the big difference is that they would discuss the nuclear program basically within the first month. So really nothing too much to see there. On another note, Al Jazeera reported that Iran had offered a 15-year moratorium on nuclear enrichment, but after that, that's basically like a sunset clause. After that, they'd be able to enrich to uranium to 3.67%, which is very similar to what would happen with JCPOA. Problem with this proposal is that Trump doesn't want any enrichment at all in the future at all, which Iran will never agree to. There was the issue that he had with the JCPOA, which We actually have sunset clauses in this. And the reason those sunset clauses were there, according to those who negotiated it in the Obama administration, was because there were supposed to be subsequent negotiations as the JCPOA was in place, right? And so it wasn't going to they weren't just going to resume enrichment one day after the sunset clause, because the conversations would continue, trust would continue to be built, and that kind of thing. So May 4th comes along, and this is when Operation Project Freedom comes into play. And since Monday, when this has happened, both sides have traded blows. Okay. CENTCOM reported that 3 vessels actually were able to traverse the strait. Iran claims to have attacked naval assets from the U.S. Navy. The UAE was attacked in a missile barrage, okay, by Iran. They promised to respond in kind. The attacks continued into yesterday morning. There was an attack on oil depots and different energy infrastructure within Dubai, within the UAE. And specifically at Fujairah, I might be botching that, Iranian drone struck a petroleum industry zone and it caused a fire. This was the UAE's key Hormuz bypass hub. So I mean, I could speculate and say perhaps the ships that CENTCOM claimed made it out of the Strait of Hormuz. They may have been tied to the UAE in some way. So that may be why Iran attacked them in their ports. So I'm just speculating there, but that could be one of the reasons. And there was also the claim that the U.S. had sunk 6 of the speedboats that Iran uses to harass shipping through the strait. So a lot of activity. And according to Pete Hegseth and Dan Kane in a press conference they gave yesterday, these hostilities that we've seen break out since the start of Project Freedom don't meet the threshold to resume military hostilities formally. Now, the U.S. has retaliated. I think it was on Kesham Island. I think they bombed Kesham Island lightly yesterday, but formal hostilities haven't started over yet. Now, even though all of this has happened, Trump still says that the war is not started. Of course, it's not restarted. And one of the reasons is because of the, I would actually say it's not even a reason anymore. So about a week ago, this 60-day threshold that Trump had before he asks Congress for permission to wage war on Iran, that's what he would have had to do. It ran out because of the ceasefire. So about a week before the 60-day deadline, Trump and Iran, the U.S. and Iran got the ceasefire. And so hostilities ended. Like the 60th day came, and Trump said to Congress, well, we're not at war, so I don't have to seek permission. And after today, the clock starts over. So in theory, he could start the war back, and it would be another 60 days before he would have to ask Congress for permission to wage the war. Now, as of today, yesterday, I believe it was announced, Operation Project Freedom was paused by Donald Trump. So that was another taco moment. But according to Axios from today, the White House is nearing a preliminary deal and expects a response from Iran to a new set of proposals authored by Washington within 48 hours. Now, the details on this proposal and the points within the proposal are scant right now, but Iran has not responded to the claims that from Washington that allegedly come from the White House. Trump came out later on this morning and he said that to the New York Post that it's too soon for peace talks, but failure to agree to a deal would trigger intensified military action, which really means nothing at all. So that's not likely. In Washington's proposal, briefly, there would be, again, if it sounds like this stuff is just being repeated, it is. Again, backroom negotiations are likely going on. And these issues that we're seeing right here are likely being discussed on a very technical basis. And this is why when we hear the White House talk about negotiations, they're talking about it very broadly, like, oh, we're still talking, but if they don't make a deal, X, Y, Z. Technical talks are probably happening right now. I can't know that, but that's my assumption there. But there would be a moratorium on enrichment. The duration would be unspecified. Enhanced inspections, gradual lifting of sanctions, and asset release in return. Gradual lifting of restrictions on Hormuz during the 30 days of talks. And against this backdrop, the current foreign minister to Iran, Aras Aragachi, met with his counterpart in Beijing, Wang Yi, for talks about the war, likely about aid and support and this kind of thing, which was really an interesting move to make, especially as we can assume some kind of talks are going on between Washington and Iran. Now, of course, the Chinese and Wang Yi are currently calling for a comprehensive ceasefire, not surprising, and claims his country is deeply distressed by the war, expecting their oil out, their oil taken, and that kind of thing. He said further, "We believe that a comprehensive ceasefire brooks no delay. A resumption of hostilities is inadvisable, and persisting with negotiations," and there's the key there, persisting with negotiations, is particularly important. Now, China is just as eager as the US for the traffic to start flowing again through the Strait of Hormuz and for the war to end. Rubio urged about a week ago that China press Iran to open the strait, and Trump is due to visit China next week. He actually had to postpone his meeting with Xi Jinping. He was supposed to meet with him last month, and they were supposed to discuss trade. And the meeting was reset for next week. And so you add on to that the worsening economic situation in the US domestically. You have a recipe for what could potentially shape up to be a deal before too long. Trump wants a trade deal with China. I think he wants that more than a nuclear deal with Iran, possibly. Again, the domestic economic situation in the US is getting worse. This is hurting China to a large extent, and so they're pressing Iran to make a deal. And so all of these pieces are coming together, and if I'm just doing a general reading of the tea leaves, it seems likely that something will come out of whatever discussions are taking place right now, even if it's temporary. But I don't, again, as I've always said, I don't see a formal resumption of hostilities anytime soon, especially after the issues that we've had over the past couple of days with the back and forth firing or the return to hostilities. And as we talk about some of the domestic issues that are affecting the US, $5 gas prices and $7 in some places, absolutely ridiculous. But also car makers are sounding the alarm, specifically in Detroit. GM, Ford, and Stellantis have warned that the financial hit from higher commodity prices, like energy, of course, different plastics and car inputs, will rise to $5 billion this year as the Iran war strains supply chains. Aluminum is also affected, paying to all of these things. And they could be forced to cut vehicle discounts and ultimately raise prices as the conflict drags on. And, due to COVID and everything resulting from COVID, prices for cars were already high. It's been bad. And so that's going to be a huge hit to the car makers. Could be looking at potential layoffs in the future if it goes on any longer. So again, I would think that Trump sees all this stuff. He's not, I don't know if I can say he's not completely cynical, but I would say that he cares a lot less, it seems, about the domestic economy over the past couple of months. So we're going to touch on some news from Venezuela and the Southern Caribbean. The energy matrix could see benefits from the long-term outcome of the war in Iran. And this is largely because in the future, we don't know what investment is going to look like when it comes to this, Middle East complex of oil producers, raw materials producers. And I would say that this is one of, not just China, but this situation in the Middle East is likely one of the reasons why Trump has been searching so hard for alternative supply chains and sources of raw materials and this kind of thing, like rare earths and alternative sources of oil and gas within the Western Hemisphere, because of a lot of the issues and the way things are shaping up over in the Middle East. We know things are never going to be the same, and the safe havens that once existed in like Dubai and the Emiratis, for example, aren't going to be there anymore. Military assets and bases have essentially been destroyed by Iran. There's a big realignment that's going on in the Middle East, and it's for the foreseeable future after this war is finished. And so the focus is going to certainly be on countries like Guyana, where you have these large oil and gas reserves, Trinidad, Venezuela, of course. The focus is going to be on these countries, natural resources there, and alternative supply chains away from these more high-risk areas in the Middle East, for example. So it's going to be this area that Trump has focused on last year, and he's still focusing on, because Cuba, many are saying, is going to be the next domino to fall. This will become an important geopolitical area globally. China has had its eyes on it. They've been investing in countries like Venezuela and this kind of thing. So there have been changes over the course of the past couple months, of course, since Maduro was kidnapped by the U.S. The most visible changes, of course, has been the lifting of sanctions and legal reforms to oil and gas and mining industries, these sectors that attract a lot of foreign investment. They've been reintegrated into the country and into the global markets. So this is specifically when we're talking about the legal reforms, the hydrocarbons law that was amended or passed a couple months ago, and that encourages private investment, tax reforms. Private firms have more autonomy to operate within Venezuela than they did before, without the government basically managing everything that they're doing. Additionally, this is observed by human rights groups, though, that material conditions for the citizens haven't really changed too much, right? And this is kind of what I expected. And this is the same thing I expected back home. This is what I said months ago, and that's that when Trump makes this move, all the moves he's making, a very small cadre of oligarchs, both in Venezuela and the U.S., will benefit from it. People really won't. So you could have probably still just made a deal with Maduro without going through all the trouble, letting our military hardware sit in the Caribbean. It's still there for, months on end. Our personnel out at sea for months when they should be rotating. Ships need repairs and that kind of thing. The government machinery still largely remains in place. You have a new president. The institutions haven't changed too much, but there have been moves to remove people who aren't loyal to Delcy Rodriguez, the standing president in Venezuela. She has moved to consolidate power, and she's launched sweeping political reforms and reshuffles that has sidelined key Maduro-era figures. She replaced a major portion of the cabinet and military leadership, including long-standing officials in the defense and judiciary. And U.S. oil giants are looking at these developments, and they're getting technical teams out to Venezuela to explore the potential for investment, like, for example, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. This is from the Financial Times. In recent weeks, both Exxon and Conoco have met with Venezuelan officials and sent technical teams, as they said they would do in January when Trump had convened all of the energy majors to the White House, and they talked about potential investments. Exxon didn't make a commitment. Conoco didn't make a commitment, but they said they would send technical teams to assess the political situation, the investment environment, and all of these different things. So Exxon's team inspected the Cerro Negro heavy oil project that is operated before 2007, when Chavez's government nationalized much of the oil and the energy infrastructure. Conoco is also trying to assess oil and gas opportunities. Neither company has committed capital to projects in the country. There's been a sharp rise in oil prices, and this is one of the biggest reasons, along with the government reforms, that these companies are jumping on these opportunities now. Now, at the same time, power suppliers are looking to get back into Venezuela to start repairing the grid. It's about 10 years. It's about 10 years behind in terms of renovations. But many of the power suppliers are hesitant to go in because they need payment guarantees. Now, this is part of what will need to be addressed before these larger oil and gas firms and investment in general comes into Venezuela. Basic infrastructure, not just, oil and gas wells, but power lines, the grid, and that kind of stuff. And it seems likely that the revenues that the U.S. is holding will be it's the Treasury that's supervising the revenues from the oil that's being exported from Venezuela. So as you know, in January, Trump said that we are basically going to take the oil and we're going to sell it. We're going to take the money, and the Treasury is going to manage the money. So it's really Venezuela's oil. It's their assets. And so you'd wonder, are they going to distribute these assets to these power providers and power technicians to come out and renovate and bring up to date Venezuela's power infrastructure? So the power plants have, like we just said, they haven't been properly prepared or maintained for 10 years. And many of the providers don't know how they get paid. Less than 40% of Venezuela's generation capacity is available, leading to frequent outages and limiting the nation's manufacturing capacity. So they need to figure all of that out, which projects to prioritize, which will probably be the ones that are most directly affected by, again, investment from oil and gas firms and that kind of thing. Not projects for the people, right? To make sure that they're not experiencing continuous outages like in Cuba. It's going to be those projects that are prioritized are going to be the ones that benefit the major firms that are wanting to invest there. So that's an unfortunate but unavoidable reality. So long stretches without power, but it seems like there are moves happening in Venezuela. And if these economies continue the way that they're going, political reform takes place, which I don't think is likely. Infrastructure is basically rebuilt and renovated. A country like Venezuela, you tie it to Guyana, where they have these large offshore discoveries that Exxon has been exploiting, and other Caribbean countries that produce energy, both upstream and downstream services. You tie that together, and you have a pretty good combination you have a decent combination of countries that could potentially in the future become what the Middle East was before Trump decided to take us to war with Iran. So just a thought there. But wrapping up here, I wanted to touch just briefly on this troop withdrawal from Germany that Trump announced. And he has ordered 5,000 U.S. troops withdrawn from Germany. And this is because, of course, Germany has been uncooperative in Trump's war of aggression against Iran. They didn't want anything to do with it. Most European countries didn't want anything to do with it. It's not that all of them didn't assist in some way, but they didn't want to contribute directly to reopening the strait, which was open before Trump started the war. And so he's basically punishing them. This is not much of a punishment, really, but, we'll go on here. The Pentagon has previously said that its longer-term goal is to have Europe take the lead on its own conventional defense and to gradually reduce the American military presence on the continent. It comes days after German Chancellor Friedrich Merz criticized Trump's handling of the war in Iran. saying Iran's leadership was humiliating the U.S., which he's right. Not used to German officials actually having a spine to say that kind of thing to Trump, but there you go. So have about 36,000 U.S. troops there in the country, and it's America's biggest military hub in Europe. So this would represent about a 14% drawdown of the 36,000 troops in the country. John Parnell, the chief Pentagon spokesman, said that we expect the withdrawal to be completed over the next 6 to 12 months. Senior defense officials said the decision would result in the removal of an army brigade. It will reserve a Biden, it will reverse, and this is the key basically to all this that ties into the Russo-Ukrainian war, but it will also reverse a Biden administration decision to deploy a battalion with long-range conventional missiles to Germany later this year. And that's really the key to this, right? A lot of European leaders, particularly in Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states and that kind of thing. Of course, your right-wing individuals within the U.S. government and left-wing, it's really a bipartisan thing. The idea of removing these troops and these long-range capability, this long-range missile capability hardware from Germany in the middle of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, when all of these European countries are terrified and think that Russia is going to invade all their countries any day now, sends a bad signal. In my mind, I think it's actually a good thing, because perhaps this is kind of a tip of the hat to Putin in negotiations that are coming up or ongoing. Who knows? But this is something that has directly contributed to the war with Ukraine. The idea that Ukraine would potentially become a NATO member and you'd have military hardware at Russia's border. And so we're removing the promise of military hardware in Germany and removing troops. This could be a sign not only to Germany to start maybe reindustrializing themselves, like we talked about in the previous video, but it might be a sign to the Russians that, hey, here's an act of goodwill. Let's sit back at the negotiating table and figure something out. And you can call that naive if you want to, but that's just kind of how diplomacy works. It's these small things that you see that actually matter. Or it could be nothing, and Trump could basically be just throwing a tantrum because Mertz had the gall to actually just say, hey, you made a stupid move by trying to do what you're doing in Iran. Who knows? But if anything, perhaps, as I talked about before, with Germany basically revamping their military industry, their military producing industry, maybe, if anything, this again will galvanize them. This move will galvanize them and get them to a place where they can start investing less in their welfare state and more in military industrialization, if they're so afraid of Russia. I don't think that Russia is a threat to Germany. They were a great partner before the U.S. and Ukraine basically drew us into this war in 2022. The U.S. and Germany were doing very well together economically, right? But they're all afraid. So maybe what they should all do is, again, militarize, find a way to defend yourself. But, the truth of the matter is that in the end, this really means not much at all, except for the fact that because we know that the U.S. is not going to decouple from NATO, and we're not going to withdraw all of our troops and personnel. This is like a small thing, and that's why I put the theory out there that this could be sort of a way for Trump to slap Mertz around for talking shit and giving a tip of the hat to Putin for future negotiations. Goodwill, showing some goodwill. So that does it for me. I want to thank everybody for joining me, and if you liked the video, hit subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment, let me know what you think.